This is the recap video on derivation and productivity. So what is derivation? What are some examples of derivation in English? And what are some basic differences between derivation and inflection? These are the first things we're going to talk about, and then we'll talk about productivity. So very light on derivation, and then more so on productivity. And these differences between derivation and inflection continue in the following week's lecture, where we go more in detail. This is just sort of a basic separation. So, as a reminder, inflection is some sort of change in grammatical meaning, while derivation is a change in lexical meaning or category. So we've always taken a binary approach, and we've said that affixes are either derivational or inflectional. But we're going to ask, can a single affix behave somewhat derivationally and somewhat inflectionally? And that's really the focus of next lecture. This one is more so like, what are the core differences between inflectional and derivational affixes? So, derivation, we've seen some with a few different standard meanings, such as the agentive before. We've talked about that. We've also talked about the negative prefix as well. So these are some common ones in English, and these have names. So agentive is something that turns an action into a person. So work act or. The diminutive is something that turns an animal into like a baby form. So pig to piglet, owl to owlet. So they sound very similar there. We have these reversatives. So to undo something or to unfriend someone. We have these degree derivational affixes like super, hyper, extra, supra. And we have these negatives. So like dis and un and in and so on. So although we can give these names to a lot of these different derivational morphemes, it's not always obvious like what the abstract quality it is or what to name these. So we can always talk about these in terms of category changes as well, which is what I've been suggesting that we do for a lot of our meaning components in earlier lexical entries. So instead of describing something as an agentive or diminutive, we can call these processes either denominals or deverbals or deadjectivals. And this just depends on what it came from. So a denominal is a word that formed from a noun. So you can have a case where the noun changes, so from summary to summarize. So summarize is what is called a denominal because it is no longer in its nominal or noun form. But you can also call this the same thing for like a bicycle to bicycler, where the category is staying the same. The term applies, although you don't normally hear it being called a denominal. You just say it's like it's an end-to-end rule. The term applies, you just don't hear it as often as you would in a case like where the category does change. So with deverbals, it's the same idea. So something that was a verb, so coming from a verb like to act to an actor, or to interest someone to become an interesting item. So both of these, verb to noun, verb to adjective, they used to be verbs. That's why they're called deverbals. And deadjectivals, same way. Something formed from an adjective. So strange can become stranger, or intense to intensify. Both of those were adjectives, and they changed their category to something else. But the important part is that they were adjectives at some point. Their new form was based on an old adjectival form. So this is just a nice way to describe our changes in derivation, so we don't need to think of like, well, what is the meaning? Of course, understanding what the meaning is in an abstract sense is important, but in terms of describing what it does to other people in a very simple way, in terms of word categories, this terminology is widely used. So here's some basic inflection versus derivation differences, because there really isn't much to say about like a nice, simple, straightforward definition of a derivation. So let's understand them in terms of some differences. So the first major difference is that with inflections and derivations, if you have a word that could take the affix, if it's inflectional, it has to take it. If it's derivational, it's optional. So what do I mean by this? Let's say we have the third person singular agreement S in English. So if you have a third person singular subject, you have to have that S on the verb. So because it is possible for the S to show up, because this is a third person singular and the verb can take agreement, it must take agreement because it's an inflection. It has to be there. But in derivation, the word, the inflection, or sorry, the affix doesn't have to show up. So for instance, you can say he walked quickly with an ly, and you could contrast it with a sentence like he walked fast. But you could even say he walks quick. That's acceptable in English. You can use the adjective form as an adverb when you're speaking. And you can see in this case, we don't have the ly there. So the ly could show up, but it doesn't have to. So that's how we know it is derivational, because it doesn't have to show up. It's the same in something like the feminine suffix, like ess. So if you look at a word like actor or actress, it is totally fine to use the word actor for any gender. But actress has to be used usually specifically with women. But you don't have to use actress to describe a woman. It doesn't have to be there. So we can say it's derivational because you can omit it and use a different form. While with the inflections, if you want to express, if you can express that, you have to express that. Okay, the other thing is that when you apply an inflection, let's say something inflects on nouns, that inflection should be able to appear on every single noun in some form, whether it's regular or irregular. So every noun can take a possessive S, whether it's Stephen's, one word, the Queen of England's, 4 words, happiness, happiness's downfall. This is an abstract concept, and it can still take the possessive S. Well, derivation has a lot of these gaps. So, for instance, with dom, kingdom can have the dom suffix on it. But there's nothing like workdom or eagledom or voter frauddom, and these are all other nouns. And with something like a workdom, we can think about this. It's an area where work is done. An eagledom, maybe it's a kingdom of eagles or something. We can come up with meanings for these, but these are ungrammatical. We don't have these forms. So that derivational suffix, dom, it looks derivational. It doesn't apply to everything. And finally, when we talk about the position of derivational and inflectional affixes, usually the derivations tend to appear closer to the root than the inflections. So if we take a look at where the roots are in all of these images, we will never see an inflection like in front of a derivation. We'll never see the inflection closer to the root than another derivational element. So what I mean here is like governmentalizations, mentalization. These are all derivational. And finally, our inflectional suffix is at the end. Same with runners. We have a derivation and then our inflections. It's not inflection then derivation. In the case of ex-boyfriends, okay, sure, we have both derivational and an inflectional suffix, but it's not as if there's some D coming after. So in terms of closer to the root, these are both fine. So derivation is closer to the root than inflection. There's no reason we couldn't put some other derivation in between, right? So these are just general trends. This might not apply all of these properties to every inflectional or derivational affix, as we'll see in the next lecture video, but these are trends. So now let's talk about productivity, and we introduced derivation because our discussion about productivity relates to derivation rather than inflection. So what is productivity? What are the constraints, and how do we measure it? Okay, so productivity is a measure of how wide a pattern or rule creates new words. And those new words are called neologisms or neologisms or neologisms. I've heard every single pronunciation, so whatever you want to say is fine. So basically, if you have a suffix that creates a lot of new words, it's highly productive. It's productive in making new words. If you have a suffix or prefix that doesn't make many new words, it's not very productive. It's unproductive because it doesn't make new words. So productivity is just like how well does it create new things? How many new things does it create? So if we think about the th suffix in English, that takes a verb and turns it into a noun. So for instance, grow to growth, or take an adjective deep into a property depth, or warm to warmth. And we can ask, how many different new forms can we make with th? Like if we were to make a new word, let's pick an adjective. Something to do that could be well, it's a property, right? So let's say cool. How cool something is. Can we create a form like cool? No, this sounds very bad. So it doesn't sound like it's very productive with this example. And we could create many new examples and get some judgments, and we'd find that no, this is a pretty unproductive suffix. And you can see the contrast with something like the able suffix in English. So turn, to be turnable, that's an adjective. So verb to adjective, eat to edible, love to lovable, verb to adjective. Okay, so we can pretty much take any verb and add able to it. So we could have like hug, and then we get huggable. What about, I don't know, a word like torture, in keeping up with the theme of attacking, torturable. What about paint, paintable? Yeah, this is a pretty productive rule. And even if you might not be sure how productive it is, we can at least order the productivity between, say, something like th and able. So at the very least, even if we don't have like a very objective value of how productive something is, we can still think of relative productivity. So which suffixes are more productive than others? Now, there used to be this concern or this difference about productivity and creativity. So productivity would be about how speakers create new words unintentionally. So the idea is the users are just speaking and they need to express some meaning, so they pull stuff out of their heads and create new words. So like, unlike the others in his class, Dave was considered uncivilizable. So maybe I want to have that meaning like, oh, he can't be tamed in a classroom. I don't know the form, so I think, oh, to be civilized. And I know that un is not, so I can say he's uncivilized, but he can't be made to be civilized, so I say uncivilizable. Okay, some of you might have heard this word before. Maybe others haven't. So maybe this isn't the best example, but this is a word that I haven't really encountered in speech. Creativity, on the other hand, is about how speakers create new words intentionally. So when you're doing this, you're not actually using your subconscious grammar, you're using your conscious understanding of the language, which is sometimes flawed, as we know. There's a difference between comprehension and production. So in this case, here's an example of something truly creative. I decided to pay monthly for this gym because it was considered to be the best exhaustum in the country. Now, there's nothing wrong with this meaning. We know what dumb roughly means, like king and kingdom. It's a place where a king governs. So this is like a place where you are exhausted. But we know it's not very productive. We know we can't usually create new words with this. So when speakers hear it, they're like, ooh, I have issues with this. Even though a native speaker might have created it, other speakers might take issue with it. So the reality is we don't really need a distinction here, because if something is creative, if it's intentional and it's poorly received, then it'll have a low productivity rating. While if people are really into it and people use it all the time to make new words, it'll have a high productivity rating. So we can keep this term creativity in our heads, but we don't really need to make a distinction between these two things in terms of practicality. So let's think about these suffixes and wonder if they are productive or unproductive. So just think of these relatively, and I'll just talk through these. So in a word like recreate, this is like a repetitive suffix. This has a very high productivity. So I'm just going to write like high, medium, and low here. This is a very highly productive prefix. Any action, you can do it again. So eat, to re-eat something, that's kind of gross. But, you know, it is possible to try, to retry, to attempt, reattempt, to fall, to refall. You know, you can do all these things. In unstoppable. Pretty much any adjective in the able form you can turn into an unform. This is a very highly productive morpheme. You can create a lot of new words with it. For and forgive, however, this is no longer something that we use. So we don't say to for use something or to for create something. This is not a very productive prefix in English. Perhaps historically, but not today. Hyperactive. So in this case, this means to be more than. So hyperactive, to be more than active, to be above regular levels of activity. In casual conversation, you might not create many new words with this, but in sciences, it's totally fine to use hyper or hypo to describe above or below. So this isn't one of those medium to low ranges. I made a more committed answer in class to which side it was on, but I'm just going to use sort of this general circle. Because to be honest, without actual statistical data, it's hard to be sure. But this is just my estimate based on comparing it to re and un. It does feel like it's more active than for, so probably more in this area, but definitely not as productive as re or un. What about ling, as in like earthling or a weakling or a starling or something? This is another one of those medium to low creative things. So you could be like oh yeah, you're like a student ling, or like a class ling, an SFU ling. That sounds a little weird, right? So maybe mid to low, more on the low end. Finally, health-wise, taste-wise, any sort of thing related to a property, you can get the suffix wise on it. So again, this is another one of those cases where I believe it's pretty clearly in the medium range. But again, we need some more statistical data for this, so this might have differed a little bit from the one that I gave in class. Again, as you think about these things, sometimes ideas change, but with actual statistics, we could come up with something pretty clean. But I'd say there's probably two very clear groups on productivity right down here. So I'd put ling and for in about the same group. Maybe give re and un special status, and then the other two in the middle. But again, these are just relative orderings. What would be important here is knowing for sure that these are very highly productive morphemes, and knowing for sure that something like for is very low. And you could just look at a dictionary or something to find words that start or end with these suffixes or prefixes, if you wanted something more concrete and if you're uncertain about your intuitions or other people's guesses about them. So what are the restrictions? Why can't we create certain forms? Well, the reality is that it's not just a morphological thing. It's a syntactic thing, it's a meaning thing, it's a phonological thing. So here are different constraints on English productivity. So sometimes phonological features can stop new words from being formed. So to do this en suffix, in other words, to make something whatever the description is, like to darken or to lighten, this cannot attach to bases that end in anything but an obstruent. So what this means is that if it ends in a nasal, if it ends in a liquid, if it ends in a vowel or a glide, it cannot appear on those forms. You cannot put the en suffix on those forms. So for instance, greenen, this ends in an N, this ends in a nasal, so you cannot do en, even though you can do to redden, or to blacken, or to darken, or to whiten, or to lighten. You cannot do to greenen because of the sound. Same with to blueen. You can't do to blueen because it ends in a vowel sound. So this is phonologically constrained. ly, taking an adjective and turning it into an adverb, like happily, terribly, fashionably. You can't add it to bases that already end in ly. So we can't say chillily. And that's the restriction on that. Sometimes it's the stress of a word that affects it. So this deverbal suffix al only attaches to words that have a stressed final syllable. So arrival, rival is stressed. Removal, removal, move is stressed. Deferral, deferral, fur is stressed. In a word like showcase, showcase, show is stressed. So when we say showcaseal, it sounds really weird. Now, if we change the stress to make a showcasal, to make a showcasal out of something, we can make it sound better. So if we want to put the al suffix on something, it has to attach to a stressed final syllable. So these are cases where the phonology are restricting productivity. It can be meaning-based too. So what's interesting about these negative prefixes un and in is that they have to attach to something with a positive quality. So you can say unattractive. Attractive is a good quality. Unfun. Fun is a good quality. So you can put un on there to make it negative. You're taking something positive and you're turning it into something negative. That's essentially what's happening. But with something like unugly or unboring, you can't attach unto it, and that's because ugly and boring are negative. These are inherently negative properties. So when you attach unto it to say unugly, this doesn't work. So actually what this says is that the un is not reversing. So the un does not mean not. Because if un meant not, then we could do unugly. Instead, what un does is it takes something positive or something neutral and turns it into a negative, or just takes its positivity away. So ugly doesn't have any positivity to remove. Boring doesn't have any positivity to remove. Therefore, we can't attach unto it. So this actually shows us a little bit more about the meaning of un. It takes something with a positive quality and it just removes it. Okay. Here's an interesting pragmatic thing about German. I thought this was an interesting one. German doesn't have female nouns for animals like worms and beetles. These are like really low animals because there's no point in distinguishing the gender of those animals. So in other words, they're so insignificant, they don't deserve a male and female form. It's just a form for that animal. So pragmatically, it's not worth discussing, so the form just can't exist. And that is, it's I don't know, I find that interesting and both weird at the same time, that is something that can be decided. Sometimes it has to do with the base itself. So what other morphemes are happening, or where the morpheme came from originally. I should say that the root. So for example, the ish suffix, red-ish, fun-ish, tall-ish, dog-ish, expensive-ish, hopeful-ish, optional-ish, representable-ish. These are on like this continuum of acceptability. So some of you might like these, some of you might not like these. But the idea is that usually ish just likes to attach to a base that hasn't been modified. So hopeful-ish sounds weird because you have full. You have this affix already on it. Optional-ish is weird because you have yun and all. These are two affixes, and then you're attaching ish after. Representable-ish, same idea. Expensive-ish, you have expense, and then you have expensive, so maybe that's a little bit weird there. But to make this sound better, we can drag on that last syllable. So yeah, that's representable-ish. That sounds weird. But yeah, that's representable-ish. Sounds better. And that's because you're distancing it from the root. So that's an interesting case in English that varies from person to person. As we saw earlier, some affixes are very particular about the bases they attach to. So this is a morphological restriction. So in can only attach to Latin bases, for example, while n attaches to Greek bases. And if there's certain noun classes, you might have restrictions on that too. So let's think about the word alcoholic. And what is the breakdown for this word in terms of morphemes? So you have a word like alcohol. This is a noun. And you have ick, which is an affix, and this creates a new noun. So this is someone who is addicted to alcohol. Now, this came up with new words like workaholic and shopaholic. And I put the brackets around here, but if we think about how alcohol was formed, really the base form should be like workahol and shopahol. But that's not actually what happens here. Actually, we took the word work and added a holic. Shop added a holic. Now, why are these other forms ungrammatical, like drinkerholic and runningholic? Well, it could be to do with the fact that we don't have a vowel there. So that could be it. Maybe holic doesn't attach to things that have a non-vowel at the end. That could be it. Or it could be that it only wants to attach to words in their infinitive form. So drinkerholic is not infinitive. It's just it's a noun. So a drinker is a noun, so you can't get holic on it. Running is a continuous action, so you can't put holic on it because it's not in its bare infinitive form. But we could also think of these as nouns, right? And this is a little bit different than what happened in class as I was thinking about this. These could be nouns too. So maybe it's not that it attaches to infinitive verbs, but that it just has to attach to a base form. So the constraint here actually is that maybe it just that can't attach to something that already has an affix. So for instance, drinkaholic. Drink doesn't have any other affix on it. Runaholic. It doesn't have any other affix on it. So we can take, say, a bare form, and we can add a holic. So jogaholic, dogaholic, if you're into, I don't know, if you're really into dogs or something. I don't know. It doesn't sound bad to say dogaholic. So productively, that's not too bad. Now, what kind of words do we have in English that expresses the same meanings? We don't really have word forms, but we have sentence constructions, like addicted to work, addicted to drinking, addicted to shopping. So if you have something, a person in society, like a stereotype, someone who is a workaholic or a shopaholic, and it becomes a widespread thing, we'd probably get those word forms in the language. So this is a case where actually the original affix ik isn't the thing that's attaching. It's actually the sound pattern of alcohol with the affix ik that has formed a new affix. So aholic is the new affix that came from the word alcohol with ik. So interesting language change there. One more concept, which is blocking. And this is the idea that we don't create new forms when we already have forms of a particular word. So for example, we have the irregular form oxen, but there's no reason we couldn't just say, let's make it regular and let's do oxes. But because we already have oxen, we don't create this new form, oxes, that is regular. Same with children. We have children, we have ren at the end. So why don't we have childs? Well, we already have children, so that's why we don't do it. This is also why it's sort of weird to give names to new objects that don't fit the description of something that already has that name. So for example, there is a term knife and there is a term cutter, and these each have their own meanings. So because cutter has its own meaning that is not knife, it is weird to call a knife a cutter because we know that they're separate things already. So this is actually beneficial for our mind because it prevents us from having a lot of like completely synonymous words. And complete synonymy is actually super rare in English. Like for instance, I'm sure in school, you're taught that the words like smart and intelligent are synonyms. They both mean the same thing. But then, of course, as you get older and you think about them in different contexts and you hear the way that they're used, you know there are very slight differences between those two terms. They refer to different things or they can. So we don't want completely synonymous words in our mind because it takes up a lot of space or whatever. It's just economical to not do that. So this concept says, well, this is why we don't do that. We're avoiding it because we want to save resources for language and words. So here's a question. We have a lot of different prefixes in English that represent the negative. So d, dis, in, non, and un. If we have blocking, why do we have 5 different forms that express un? Or express not, express that negative meaning? Is this blocking? Is this an exception to blocking? And this is really partly to do with etymology. So we borrow our words from different languages. So of course we have the Latin form, we have Greek forms, we have Old English forms, we have some French forms that might have come in too. So when we think about these, there are some differences, either in the word category. So if we think about these, this is a verb, this is an adjective, I mean, these are all adjectives after this, right? Yeah, unamusing. So there's a verb form there. So obviously this is different from the others. In, it's clearly Latin. I think this is Greek, but I'm not sure. But this isn't really an example of blocking because for historical reasons, these have come in to be on different categories and we just have not, syncretized these over time. So no, for historical reasons, this isn't really an exception to blocking. The idea about blocking is basically saying that we will never create a new negative prefix because we already have one. So we will continue with these 5 in English unless we steal some words from other languages, which, as an English speaker, give it another 20 years, we will keep doing it. Okay, so now that we know how new words are formed, well, we've been doing that the whole time, and we know how to look at different affixes, let's talk about actual word frequency and productivity. So what values can we get? Well, we can talk about generalization. So if we want to look at a morpheme and say how often does this appear, we can say, well, let's take a look at a corpus. Let's see all of the words that have that morpheme. So let's say we're looking at the feminine suffix ESS. Okay, how many words have ESS, and how many words total in our corpus use that? And we can get some number. And this is usually like a very low number. So that's how general that's how general the morpheme is in the language. The exhaustion is how often is it used when it could be used. So this is like, let's take all the words we have with the feminine suffix s, and let's combine it with all the words that could do a noun and s. So all of the words that could have it. So any sort of living thing in English could be a noun that takes that, and we'll get some number to say how exhaustive it is. So in this case, this is probably 0.1 and above. So probably 10% of words and above can take ESS. That's just my guess. I don't know. Diachronic productivity. This is really the measure of productivity. So new words. How many words are added over time? So we can do a time difference. We can say, okay, in 2022, how many words in a corpus take S, the feminine suffix, and how many in 1950 take it? And either what you're going to find is a number above 1, in other words, which says it is increasing, we're getting more words, or we'll get a number less than 1, in which case we know that actually it's not as productive as it used to be. We're getting less words overall. Less words use it. We're actually getting a decrease in that suffix. Now there's a few more ways of measuring things, but we won't talk about that just because they use more complicated measurements. So I wanted to bring up one study that we didn't get to talk about in papers, but just an illustration of productivity. So McCloy looked at the D-verbal ER. So this is like banker, worker, typewriter, elevator words here. To see how productive this morpheme was. And they looked at two things. They looked at animacy versus inanimacy. So let's just take a look at table 4 here, just to see the different classes. So was the noun animate or inanimate? So in other words, something like animate is a banker, while something like elevator is inanimate. It's not real. And also compared agentive versus instrumental. So is something an action? So you could think of something like an emulsifier. So like something that emulsifies air. What's another word? Like a diffuser could be something like that too. It's an agent. It does its own action. While something could be an instrument, as we've seen before, like an elevator, a typewriter, or so on. This is something that someone else has to do actions on to get it to work. Okay. And in table 3 on the right side, under tokens, which I'll do in pink, this tells us how many of each one we've seen. So 3,827 animate agents, only one animate instrument, a rider and his horse that were used as a marker, whatever that means. It's pretty much negligible. 137 inanimate agents and 765 inanimate instruments. So we can actually see here which types of words are the most common, animate agents and inanimate instruments. But we do have some inanimate agents. So when we take a look at how productive these are, we can see that the instrument cases are actually more productive. So now there are more new words being created that are used instrumentally, and more of the new words are made for inanimates. Even though we have more agentive tokens, the amount of new words, like relative to how many words there are total, says that the instruments, the inanimates, are actually more productive. Now, there's one more thing here in this diagram called the hapax legomena, and this is just basically in a giant corpus, how many of those words appeared only once. So for instance, what this says is maybe in the data set you had banker 3 times. Okay, then banker would not show up as a hapax legomena. But what if we had, I don't know, like a truther or something like that, and that showed up just once? Then that would be a token in the hapax legomena. But none of those calculations were shown here. So we can actually plot that, and that's what they did. And what I want to show here is the trend. So as you get more tokens of a word, you can see how productive it is, so how many new forms you're getting. So as they found more terms of agency and animacy, what they found is that it trended that over time it was roughly 0.1 or 10% like productivity. Now, they didn't find as many inanimate tokens. So this is where sort of the trend line stopped. Now, we don't know if this continues, if you were to find more and more tokens, if this would end up around 0.16 at 16%, or maybe in the end it would actually converge and we would get something that says, well, actually, if we keep getting more tokens, and if it were more as common, the productivity might actually be only 10%, just like the other one. So it looks like the inanimate instrumentals are more productive, but if we were to take a look at very, very, very large corpora, or maybe multiple ones, and get a lot more tokens, we might find that they're actually about as productive as each other. So a little bit more of a higher concept there, but just interesting notes about productivity. So that's it for this video. The next one is coming soon. If you have any questions, you know how to contact me. Yeah, video over. Trevor out. Peace.